Is the Raiden Shogun a bad character? No, she's not. If we're talking meta-wise, you would have to be insane to think that she's bad. Unless you're one of those poor souls who doom posted her on launch and somehow refuse to acknowledge that she is probably one of the most powerful units in the game right now. But whether or not she was a good character in the story was something that was always up for debate. The Raiden Shogun, or A if you will, is an extremely polarizing character in terms of writing. People either love her or they hate her, even to this day. Not only was she the first female waifu archon introduced to us, but she was also the first archon who wanted us dead. She was also actively harming the citizens of Inazuma in her pursuit of said eternity. At least that was what was happening when we got to Inazuma. While the Fatui did play a major role in destabilizing Inazuma, it is also later revealed that A willingly turned a blind eye towards almost the entire thing. And after the whole civil war that caused the deaths of countless Inazumans, we didn't really get to see A being held accountable for her actions. And I feel like the whole mess that was 2.1 spacing gave A the reputation of a badly written character that wasn't held accountable because she's a waifu, but I actually don't think this is true. But before we get into that, let's get into why people think A, at least when compared to the other 3 archons that we know, is terrible. The badly paced Inazuma Archon quest. As a day 1 player and massive weeb, I was looking forward to Inazuma a lot. The game had already left us multiple hints that the Inazuma Archon Bal wasn't going to be as friendly as Venti or Zhongli and is currently doing questionable things to her people. And when we got to Inazuma, we got to see that the things were indeed pretty bad. The Sakoku decree was in place, which if you don't remember what that means is that the borders of Inazuma is essentially closed, save for the Fatui and several Snezhnayan merchants who can travel freely due to their diplomatic ties. The only other way to get out of Rito as a foreigner is to get yourself a travel permit. And as you can probably imagine, this harms Inazuma's economy greatly. And on top of that, through Ayaka and Toma, we got to see firsthand how the Vision Hunt decree was affecting the vision holders in Inazuma. Despite vision holders being a very, very small percentage of the Inazuma population, the game made it clear that a lot of people were suffering from the Vision Hunt decree, the Sakoku decree, and just how bad the state of Inazuma was when we got there. Not long after, we get to the Resistance and we get to see up close what the Civil War was like in Yashiori Island. And let's not forget that that's an entire island that's inhabitable because of the war caused by the Vision Hunt decree. We got to see the horrors of war and how innocent people were getting caught in the crossfire of war, losing their homes and family, as they often do in real life. And by the end of the second act, it was crystal clear that the Shogun was causing harm to her people. Say what you want about the Inazuma Archon quest, but the first 2 acts were good. They were actually really good. The build-up for both the Shogun, the Tenryou Commission, the Resistance was executed really, really well, only for it to implode in the very last act. Not only did the third act force the Fatui was behind everything plot without any proper build-up other than one mention of Signora in Rito, and then making Kokomi seem incompetent in the process, they also tried to make me care about an NPC in the span of 20 minutes. I think Teppei is a terribly written NPC. You can come for me for this, but his death literally made me feel nothing. I mean, I felt bad for the guy, but I barely knew him. And at that point, I realized the writers were trying to do too much all at once by shoving all of these different storylines in one act. And mind you, the third act of Inazuma only lasted 2.5 hours. Compare that to Sumeru's last act, which is Act 5, which took almost like double that amount, almost 4 hours. And after meeting Scaramouche, Fatui Bad, and a brief training arc with Yae Miko, which I can't even call an arc because it was one training session. It lasted a day. We made our move to infiltrate Tenshukaku, where we immediately faced off against Signora. Saw her get obliterated within seconds, and then we fight A, and through the power of Nakana, we managed to defeat her and change her mind. Okay, maybe I'm undermining the story a lot here, but that was what I felt when I first played through it in the 2.1 update. There were genuinely intriguing moments that stood out to me immediately too, like when we learned how the shogun is actually a puppet, and how there are two archons in Inazuma, and how deep the corruption was in Inazuma, and an idea of the political landscape of Inazuma as we follow around Kujo Sara. Kazuha deflecting the Musono Hitotachi was also an amazing payoff to his and his dead friend's storyline. It remains one of my favorite moments in the game to this day. And finally, confronting A herself. Everything was so hype. I was so ready to confront A, only to learn that she was well aware of what the shogun puppet was doing the entire time. At least she had an idea what the puppet was doing to her people, and she didn't care, or she just didn't care enough to interfere unless it directly correlates to eternity. She basically said that if it's not about eternity, then I don't want to hear it, bitch. Making sure everything stayed in stasis was A's way to ensure that she didn't have to go through any more losses like she did 500 years ago during the cataclysm. It was in a way her own way to cope with her intense grief of losing her friends and sister. At that point, it was revealed in her character trailer that she lost two of her best friends essentially at the same time, Mikoshi Chiyo and Kitsune Saigu. And then around the same time, she also lost Makoto, which is why she did what she did right after. But at the time, the game didn't really touch on it too much. They briefly mention how A is suffering from loss in a cutscene, and I think that's it. But then, through the power of ambition, like collective ambition, we managed to change her mind, at least about the Vision Hunt decree, not about everything else. Yet. And we conclude the Inazuma Archon quest with A saying that she needs time to think on which direction she will take Inazuma going forward, which brings us to her story quest, the first one. What I, and probably a lot of other people expected, was to see how A would grow as a character and how she would take accountability for her actions in the Archon quest. After all, we did manage to change her mind about the Vision Hunt decree, and she did say that she was contemplating a lot of stuff regarding eternity. So her story quest seemed like the right time to do this, to explore this. But what we got was a quest that felt out of place, is the best way I could put it. Her story quest, the first one, is essentially us acting way too friendly to someone who just tried to kill us no less than 2 days ago, and see her slightly changing her mind about her ideology regarding eternity, something that she has not considered in the past 500 years through dango milk, photos, and light novels, instead of, well, the damage done by the war that she let happen and the fatui that she let run amok in her nation. And I admit it was actually important for her character development. A needed to learn that change, even in the little things, the simple things, can be good. And I genuinely think that her first story quest isn't as bad as people make it to be. It's not even bad in my opinion. It has good moments if you think about it. Near the end with Kujo Kamaji and the conflict within the Tenryo Commission, we got to see her act like a leader for the first time and showing mercy towards him despite what the Kujo clan did. It humanizes her and it showed us that she indeed have what it takes to be a good leader when she's not isolated for 500 years. In hindsight, given what we know now about her development later on, I think her first story quest is just misplaced. If anything, I feel like the writers couldn't have picked a worse timing to put her story quest right after ending the Inazuma Archon quest the way they did. Her story quest just didn't provide the closure that a lot of people playing back then was looking for, including myself. For those who don't know, the only available content right after the third act of the Inazuma Archon quest was Raiden Shogun's first story quest. So for a lot of people, it was the only story content we had going, and technically the story quest available right before her was Ayaka and Yoimiya's, which definitely had fan service and what some people would call a date quest, which probably contributed to people seeing A taking a stroll with the traveler as essentially another date quest, like similar to Ayaka's. I feel like it might be possible for people who started the game after 2.1, like a lot later, to have a completely different perception of Raiden's first story quest, given that they aren't technically forced to play her story quests right after the third act of the main quest, just because there's just so much content available now. But I guess to a lot of people back then, including myself, it just felt out of place, and it's almost insulting to the players who were expecting closure to the story. No one wanted to go on a stroll with A through the city right after witnessing what she did and what she let happen, and seeing how Inazuma has quite literally gone to shit because of what she did. Her first story quest was essentially Hoyo versus Wei to show us that A is more than her tough warrior, unfeeling puppet exterior. She has her unique quirks, she can't cook, she likes desserts, she has all of the qualities that make her a cute waifu who is also strong and fearless, all of which would have been good additions to A as a character if not for the fact that we just spent the last few quests seeing the pain she caused, and then seeing her not taking any repercussions, and how she f***ed up Inazuma because she couldn't really deal with her grief, Scaramouche, and comparisons to the other archons. On top of everything we just went through, we later learned that A is the reason why we even have Scaramouche. Granted, his actions aren't her fault at all. Like, she isn't to blame for the atrocities that Scaramouche did when he was living as Konikuzushi and as the balladeer. But what she did to him was morally questionable no matter how you see it. She created a being that she knew was fully sentient, but just left him to sleep, essentially abandoning him, and then never bothered interfering even though he was going on a murderous rampage in her own country. Scaramouche didn't just kill one or two people, he ended entire bloodlines. But I guess A just really couldn't bring herself, despite discarding Scaramouche after he couldn't fulfill his purpose. But you would think someone destroying the Raiden Gokaden, a tradition so important to Inazuma, that A would at least bat an eye. But the complicated relationship of A and his son is a discussion for another day. And since the release of Sumeru and its excellent writing, A is often compared to Nahida, who suffered just as much as A, and she has been nothing but kind, helpful, and benevolent to her people, who, mind you, rejected her, kept her imprisoned, and tried to replace her with a robot. And Nahida is also a newborn archon. She and A technically became archons around the same time, since also died in the cataclysm after trying to cleanse Erminsul from abyssal corruption. Even Zhuangli, who has made morally questionable decisions as well, has led Liyue without failure for thousands of years. That man was responsible for building Liyue from the ground up and cultivating it into the prosperous nation it is today. Even though he also suffered extreme grief and loss when he lost Guizhong, someone who he holds very, very dear to his heart in the Archon War. Even Venti, Mondstadt's resident alcoholic and absent Archon, still cares a lot for his people, which we have seen time and time again through his story quests and also events. He has always watched over his people and has their best interest at heart, which makes A, by comparison, just a horrible Archon in the eyes of the players. So based off the Archon quests, story quests, and hidden lore, A is selfish, incompetent, childish, and overall can be a huge bitch. But that's just not true. There's so much more to her character than her mistakes. In defense of Raiden A, here's the thing about A. She was never meant to be a leader. She was always Makoto's shadow, her body double. Her character story mentions how Makoto was never the fighter out of the two of them, so A is always the one in the front lines. Before the death of Makoto, A's whole world was war and fighting and killing. She was the one who defeated Orobashi when he tried to invade Narukami Island, so she was always a warrior, not a leader. Her incompetence in running a country shouldn't be at all surprising, considering that when Makoto died, A instantly freaked out and became terrified of erosion and spent all of her energy making puppets so she can prevent erosion, and then lived in isolation for 500 years. Literally, like up until the point we meet her. She didn't have time to grow into a great leader. It's not like you could learn to lead while staying in stasis. She has always chosen to ignore everything happening around her because she was so hyper-focused on achieving her goal, achieving eternity, and not having to feel grief or loss ever again. And this was always her biggest flaw.
But currently, Naira was also in prison, and she's a great leader right off the bat.
Well, let's not blame A for not being the wisest god in Tevad. It's not really her fault that Nahida is a wise and competent archon almost immediately. Being wise is quite literally Nahida's biggest strength as an archon. And even though Nahida lived most of her life in isolation, she has always tried her best in understanding humans, the human heart, which is something A has clearly not done until we meet her. I don't think it's fair at all to expect A, who is a warrior, to act the same way as the god of wisdom herself. Like, come on guys, give her a break.
If she's so incompetent, then the people of Inazuma should hold her accountable for all of the horrible shit she did.
And while I agree with this to some extent, it's also the reason why I think the Resistance was such wasted potential in terms of story, because they never really did anything despite being the only group of people brave enough to question and even go against the shogun's army, and by default the shogun herself. However, the society in Inazuma is based on Japan, specifically Sengoku era Japan. There's this Reddit post explaining A's ideology and actions based on real historical Japan. I'll link it below if you're interested. It's a really good read. So why is this important? Why is it that just because Inazuma is based on Japan that the people of Inazuma won't take A accountable for everything she did? It's mentioned in A's character details. If you're an Inazuman citizen, the first thing you learn is about the shogun and how great she is as a god. Everything that happens in Inazuma is for the glory of the shogun, and the people of Inazuma has always believed that their archon is both wise and strong. They never knew that they had twin archons. As far as the people of Inazuma is concerned, the Raiden shogun is one person, Makoto. So they never really had any reason to question her leadership for thousands of years, like since the Archon War. And the Vision Hunt decree, Fatui, and everything else only happened in recent years, so it was like maybe 3 years of suffering versus 2,000 years of prosperity. So she was never going to be held accountable by her people, at least not the majority, because they just have so much faith in her, both as a leader and a warrior. I mean, I could see Kokomi and the people of Watatsumi calling her out for what she did, but we all know how badly Hoyoverse handled Kokomi's writing, so...
She killed Kazuha's friend!
Well, technically, that's very much false, because it was her puppet who killed him. And even then, Kazuha's friend is the one who challenged Kujo Sara to a duel before the throne and then lost. Hence why the shogun puppet executed him. I'm kind of sure A wasn't even paying attention to the whole thing because the puppet was just carrying out what she was made to do. It's the same reason why the puppet executed Signora immediately after she lost to the traveler. Kazuha's friend literally knew what he was getting into when he went to Tenshukaku. Kazuha himself said that his friend's biggest dream was to witness Raiden Shogun's Muso no Hitotachi, so there was no way that he didn't know that was his fate if he lost the battle against Kujosara. The puppet, as explained by A herself, was given instructions to always act in the interest of eternity, no matter what, which was brilliantly explored during the Saving Grace. That was her second story quest. Her story quest, the second one, was much better received solely because I think the execution was just a lot better. Not only did the quest have really interesting and immersive mechanics, it also builds on the things that was previously established in her first story quest and the Archon quest. Not only did the quest double down on the grief A was feeling because she lost her sister and her best friends, it also showed us that she was completely unprepared to lead a nation, and she recognizes this. A admits for the first time that she has let down her people and dishonored their memories in the pursuit of eternity. She even says herself that what Inazuma needed wasn't a fierce warrior, but someone more like Makoto, whose ideal was transience. A was the first Archon, and remains the only Archon, at least as of the writing of this video, who questioned and set aside her own ideology for the betterment of her people. And right after A has this realization, the puppet instantly thinks she was affected by erosion because she was changing her mind. And afterwards, we got to see A fight her own unshakable ideals in the form of the shogun puppet. She's quite literally fighting in order to overcome her grief and past ideology that stopped her and in turn Inazuma from moving forward. At the end of the battle with the shogun puppet, A mentions that she refuses to look at the puppet as a mere tool like she did in the past, which we know is very much what she used to do. The puppet in turn said that she has indeed changed for good. So, is Raiden A bad? No, absolutely not. She is just as complex as the other Archons we've met so far. It's just that she has the most obvious flaws. To compare, Venti's most obvious flaw right now is that he's an alcoholic. And even then, your last brain cell could probably tell that he's hiding a lot behind that facade. So that's not his full story. And the same thing with Zhongli. Nahida is a victim more than anything else, hence it's kinda hard for you to criticize her as an Archon or God because she quite literally was never given the chance to even lead her own people. And it is crystal clear that she was the main victim in her circumstances. But A was the only Archon that we got to see go through so much change and development throughout the game. We couldn't have seen her growth had she been a fully developed character like Venti or Zhongli. A's writing was always about her coming into herself and finding her footing as the leader of Inazuma while accepting that her ideology of eternity was something that her people didn't need. Her first and second story quest was about confronting her past and her past ideals, which is the only way she could move forward as a person, which convinced me that she's not a badly written character at all. She's only now started her growth, and maybe down the line we get to see more of her dealing with her past actions, and it would be so interesting to watch because A has changed so much over the past year, and it leaves a lot of room for even more growth in the future, which is something that I am looking forward to. Any Archon lore is something that I welcome. So in conclusion, I think Raiden A suffers from a bad first impression, which unfortunately is, as they say, a lasting impression. So a lot of people are under the misconception that she was just badly written because the Inazuma Archon quest had pacing issues. But that would be such a disservice to the thought the writers have put in A and her growth as a character. So yeah, that's my Raiden A video. I love Genshin's lore, and I had the idea to make this when I rewatched A's second story quest, and she says she no longer views puppets as tools, which will change her dynamic with Scaramouche significantly. Like, I can't help but wonder how he would even react if he knew A is a completely different person now. But those are brainworms for another day. Let me know what you think of Raiden A. Do you think she was cooler before we got to know her, like as a villain? Or if you're on the same page as me and you like her development, feel free to correct me if I got anything wrong. It's 2 a.m. right now and I'm just about ready to pass out. Thank you for sticking around. Subscribe if you want. See you in the next one. Bye.